All right, welcome back, everyone. We are well into part 2 of the Kitab-i-Iqan, and although the theme has changed from part 1, which was mainly concerned with the interpretation of prophetic passages in Scripture, and part 2 is turning its attention to the question of the powers and capacities, what we attribute to the prophets of God. Behind these two parts of the Kitab-i-Iqan is a very similar theme, and that similar theme is maybe in a couple of words could be the theme of failed expectations. We expect reality to be a certain way, and it's not that way. Another way to put it is that reality lies beneath the surface. In part 1, we learn that there is a reality to divine scripture, which lies underneath the surface level meanings of it. And this leads us to really question the extent to which we can read divine scripture, read it out as conveying knowledge or information in the traditional sense, the sense of ilm as opposed to erfan, as we talked about earlier. And it asks the question of us, does scripture fill perhaps a different function from conveying information? Similarly, in part 2 of the Kitab-i-Iqan, we're beginning this journey into a discussion of the reality of the prophet. And here also we find that the reality of things lies beneath the surface. There's a surface level description of the prophet as sovereign over all things, as knowing all things, as having power over all things, and so forth, that emphasize the exalted nature of the prophet. But as Baha'u'llah explains, the reality of it lies underneath that surface. There's a symbolic interpretation underneath. We find this theme also, and we found it last week in the discussion of life and death and the real meaning, the true meaning of life and death. In particular, how our physical lives and deaths, marked by a certain event at a certain point in time, may not necessarily correlate to our spiritual lives and deaths. Our spiritual life doesn't necessarily begin the moment our physical life ends. What does it mean then to truly live? Is it possible to truly live that life that is promised while still in this world? And if so, then our conclusion is that the real life and death that is the subject matter of religion is something which lies underneath that surface of our physical lives and deaths. And finally, underneath the surface is this whole question of theodicy and how it is that our expectations about God are so often unfulfilled. We have to look beneath the surface of things. So this time we're looking at moving on from the question of the sovereignty of the manifestations, which Baha'u'llah says is symbolic, into the question of the continuity of divine revelation. And we're going to be looking at some fascinating themes. We'll see how much time we get to delve into each of them. The theme of prophetic finality and the continuity, as opposed to the continuity of divine revelation. More on the 3 degrees of divine revelation, which we had an introduction to last week. And we'll also be able to look at the question of the emanative circle and repetition of patterns in connection with the topics of resurrection and return of the prophets and their chosen ones. And depending on the time, we can also get a bit into the question of elixir and alchemy as symbol of spiritual transformation. So just to refresh our memories from the first session, this work is overall an answer to particular questions of the Bab's uncle. And the very first question that he asked regards the day of resurrection. And the uncle of the Bab asks, is there to be a bodily or corporeal resurrection? Um, and the other questions all can be kind of summarized as that there are certain literally understood expectations that that haven't been fulfilled. So Baha'u'llah is directly addressing this first question of the Bab's uncle here in this section that we're going to be looking at today, which is going to be around paragraphs 147 to approximately 170. So we'll be working off of this of this outline. So turning from the question of divine sovereignty to the question of continuity of divine revelation, Baha'u'llah addresses kind of the elephant in the room question, which the uncle of the Bab doesn't specifically ask, but which is doubtless behind some of his questions. And that elephant in the room is the understanding within Islam that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. It's a phrase that comes from the Quran itself. Khatamul Nabiyyin, Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, which has been nearly universally understood by Muslims as to mean that Baha'u'llah is that Muhammad is the final prophet, being their seal. He kind of puts a close on the whole notion of prophethood, so that there would be no more prophets after Muhammad. And Baha'u'llah is dealing with this question, this assumption of finality on the part of Muslims, which was a major impediment for them, of course, to accept any further revelation after Muhammad. So of course, when it comes to the Bab, first of all, claiming to be the return of the promised of the 12th Imam, that wouldn't have been quite as challenging because that was expected, at least by Shiite Muslims. But when later in his ministry, he more fully expands upon his claim to be an independent prophet, that began to clash with this understanding that there wouldn't be any more prophets. So Baha'u'llah starts to address this implicitly here in paragraph 147. And the way he does it is similarly to how he's done it in the past. He goes back in time a dispensation or two and says, look at how it was with this earlier religious group, how they interpreted things literally, how that therefore was an impediment to them understanding the truth that all of us Muslims, Baha'u'llah addressing the uncle of the Bab, understand. So he goes back to the Jewish divines, and he says, when the unseen, the divine essence caused the day star of Muhammad to rise above the horizon of knowledge, among the cavils which the Jewish divines raised against him was that after Moses, no prophet should be sent of God. So this is Baha'u'llah says that this was an understanding of the Jewish divines, and Baha'u'llah quotes them as saying that the hand of God is chained up. And Baha'u'llah says, chained up be their own hands, because divine revelation is not something which is revealed once and for all time, but which is continuous. And Baha'u'llah addressing a Muslim, the Muslim, of course, already understands this. They understand, because Muhammad is a prophet that comes after at least two other prophets, Moses and Jesus. Muslims get the idea of progressive revelation already. So Baha'u'llah is simply inviting his interlocutor to extend that concept of progressive revelation, extend that concept of continuity of divine revelation past Muhammad. But to do that is going to require a reinterpretation of how Muslims understood the idea of seal of the prophets, how Muslims have understood and interpreted the idea of resurrection, of return, and so forth.
Stephen, can I ask one question, Stephen?
Yes.
Something that I've been. Then what were they waiting for when it came to the 12th Imam? What did they think was going to happen when he returned? That's where my confusion has always been. It clearly,
the Shiites,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
The Shias are the Sunni, the Shias, of course.
Of course. I'm talking about Shias.
Yeah. There were prophets. I am not an expert on this, so I can just speak very generally that there were fairly fantastic prophecies found in some of the Islamic hadith about, obviously much later hadith, about not hadith going back to the time of Muhammad, because this was already, you're talking 12 imams, after. But there were prophecies of that 12th imam returning, of there being a promised one. These prophecies loosely based on various hadith, of which I'm absolutely not an expert, so I couldn't even point to the particular ones. But the expectations crystallized around a kind of very very, in the same sense that some Christians read out biblical prophecy as meaning Jesus is literally going to appear riding upon the clouds in the sky. Similarly, there was this idea of this imam, the promised imam, returning in these cities called, and the names of the cities were known, Jabal-Qa and Jabar-Sa, and their dimensions were known. There were going to be this many miles in circumference, and they would have this many gates and so forth. And they were stuck on this on these ideas. And of course, the Bab comes and doesn't fulfill any of these ideas. So it's just the same story repeated over that happened with Moses and that happened with Jesus.
Thanks, Stephen.
So Baha'u'llah here is pointing out the absurdity of their claim, saying, observing in this day also all these people have occupied themselves with such foolish absurdities. For over 1,000 years, they've been reciting this verse of the hand of God being chained up, and unwittingly pronouncing their censure against the Jews, utterly unaware that they themselves openly and privily are voicing the sentiments and belief of the Jewish people. So kind of hitting them where it really counts, telling the Muslims they're behaving just like the Jewish divines of, for 1,000 years. Thou art surely aware of their idle contention, that all revelation is ended, that the portals of the divine mercy are closed, that from the day springs of eternal holiness no sun shall rise again, that the ocean of everlasting bounty is forever stilled, and that out of the tabernacle of ancient glory the messengers of God have ceased to be made manifest.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I just Googled this. I said, where in the Hebrew Bible does it say that hand of God is chained up? And it doesn't. So is this just a saying in Judaism of that time period?
It looks like it's quoted in the Quran as something that the Jews of Muhammad's day said. Yes. So I don't think they were quoting from the Bible, but it's something that they said during the lifetime of Muhammad, and so it made it's found in the Quran.
Okay, thanks.
So Baha'u'llah says, and this is a really key passage, I think, here in paragraph 148. He says, the utter destitution unto which this people have fallen doth surely suffice them, inasmuch as they have been deprived of the recognition of the essential purpose and the knowledge of the mystery and substance of the cause of God. For the highest and most excelling grace bestowed upon men is the grace of attaining unto the presence of God and of his recognition, which has been promised unto all people. This is the utmost degree of grace vouchsafed unto man, and the fullness of his absolute bounty upon his creatures. So Baha'u'llah introduces this idea of attainment to the presence of God and says, this is the sort of the point of it all, and has always been the point of it all, sort of throughout time. It's been the keynote of the religion of God, whatever prophet they call their prophet. There is this idea of attaining the presence of God or returning to God. You came from God, you return to God. And Baha'u'llah then spends a great deal of the remainder of the portion that we'll be talking about today, sort of elucidating what could possibly be meant by attaining the presence of God. And he says the people have repudiated all these verses that unmistakably testify to the reality of attainment unto the divine presence. So he's quoted a number of passages from the Quran about attaining this presence of God. He says, no theme hath been more emphatically asserted in the Holy Scriptures. And then he says, some have contended that by attainment to the divine presence is meant the revelation of God in the day of resurrection. So he goes in the next few pages of looking at three possible interpretations of this. But before we get into those three interpretations, I just want to sort of point out, or sort of maybe connect some dots, that this idea of attainment to the presence of God is kind of it's a big theme in the Baha'i writings, not just here in the Kitab-i-Iqan, but and it may not be known under the phrase attaining the presence of God. It's a theme that sometimes is described using very different terminology. The terminology of emanation, that everything emanates from God and returns to God in a kind of grand circle of creation. Among the earliest pilgrim notes that we have, dating possibly as early as 1899 from May Maxwell, and along with it comes a talk given by Abdu'l-Baha about these twin sort of arcs of ascent and descent, which represent a progression away from God in a way, or a sort of successive implications of the word of God being spoken in the world that is generative and creative, and that thing that is generated and created of the world returning to its source, all through a variety of stages. And so this kind of stylized graphic on the left doesn't date to 1899, but it dates from a later period, maybe from the 1920s. And I can't help but connect another dot with an idea identified by Joseph Campbell more recently, and made famous in The Hero with a Thousand Faces and The Power of Myth and other works, where he points out what he has seen throughout world mythology as what he calls a monomyth, a kind of archetype behind most of the sacred mythologies that one finds across the world among various cultures and civilizations that otherwise are not even connected to each other in terms of ideas, interchange of ideas. So it suggests something fundamental to the human psyche, or fundamental to how people throughout history have understood our position in the world as human beings, as going through a journey away from and then returning to. It can be termed as away from one's point of origin. It can be the village. One departs from one's village, enters into an underworld where one has adventures, where one is guided by a guide, receives aid, undergoes a process of transformation, then returns to the origin point. I can't help but imagining that this is part of this divine story of emanation and return, which is part of the underlying theme of part two of the Kitab-i-Iqan. In the throughout the Baha'i writings, one finds, and this is kind of a messy chart where I tried to just throw all the spaghetti on the wall and just see it all stick. All the various terminologies that one finds in the Baha'i writings that I believe can more or less be kind of correlated and lined up in a way that overall maps out this idea of emanation and return, this idea of the creative circle, of which in part two of the Kitab-i-Iqan, the three degrees of divine emanation are found here under the purple arrows: the most holy outpouring, the holy outpouring, and the universal revelation. So in the next few pages, we're going to be looking at these three degrees of divine emanation, which roughly correlate with the divine essence in its causal interconnectedness, in its utter transcendence, and the divine essence in its manifested form, manifested through particularly through the personality of the prophet, of the manifestation of God, and finally that divine light, the light of God manifested within every atom, throughout creation in a universal revelation. The Baha'i writings, if you want to get into the details, talk about the various stages along the descending arcs and ascending arcs of this emanative circle. If you're interested in reading more about it, Nader Saidi writes about it in Logos and Civilization, and there's a few other places you can find it. But this is just one attempt at just throwing out the various ways where this idea of the emanative circle is found in the Baha'i writings. So let's look at how Baha'u'llah describes the 3 degrees of revelation in connection with the idea of attainment to the divine presence. So he gives them in kind of out of order, so to speak. He doesn't start with the highest and go to the lowest, or start with the lowest and go to the highest. He starts with the lowest. He says, should they assert that the revelation of God signifieth a universal revelation, it is clear and evident that such revelation already exists in all things. So this is that degree of divine emanation that exists within every atom, that shines forth within all created things. And Baha'u'llah says, if you interpret this phrase attainment to the divine presence as meaning that divine presence which is everywhere all at once already, then Baha'u'llah says, if by attainment unto the presence of God is meant attainment unto the knowledge of such revelation, it is evident that all men have already attained unto the presence of the unchangeable countenance of the peerless King. Why then restrict such revelation to the day of resurrection? So Baha'u'llah is kind of ticking this off as one possible interpretation of the meaning of attainment to the divine presence. He says it can't mean this, because then it's sort of true at all points of time. So to sort of specify that there's a day of resurrection doesn't make sense if every single moment is equally important. So then he goes to the second possibility in paragraph 150, which is the highest level, which is the most holy outpouring. He says, and were they to maintain that by divine presence is meant the specific revelation of God expressed by certain Sufis as the most holy outpouring, if this be in the essence itself, it is evident that it hath been eternally in the divine knowledge. Assuming the truth of this hypothesis, attainment unto the divine presence is in this sense obviously possible unto no one, inasmuch as this revelation is confined to the innermost essence unto which no man can attain. So he excludes that as a possibility. So attainment to the divine presence can't mean attainment to the essence of God, because that's inaccessible to everyone. So then that leaves the third possibility, which is the middle tier of the ringstone symbol, which is that attainment to the divine presence means attainment to the prophets of God in every age in which they appear. So it's very simply, Baha'u'llah is sort of getting to his main thesis about progressive revelation, which is that attainment to the divine presence is a cyclical phenomenon in the world and in human history, which is the center point of which is this appearance of divine revelators throughout the ages, who appear approximately every 1,000 years. So this is paragraph 151. And were they to say that by divine presence is meant the secondary revelation of God, interpreted as the holy outpouring, this is admittedly applicable to the world of creation, that is in the realm of the primal and original manifestation of God. Such revelation is confined to his prophets and chosen ones, inasmuch as none mightier than they hath come to exist in the world of being. He goes on to say, by attaining therefore to the presence of these holy luminaries, the presence of God, quote unquote, himself is attained, because the prophet or the manifestation is a kind of proxy for the divine presence. And then Baha'u'llah says, attainment unto such presence is possible only in the day of resurrection, which is the day of the rise of God himself through his all-embracing revelation. So the point that Baha'u'llah is going to make in the paragraphs that come is that this day of resurrection is not a singular event, but that it occurs with a kind of periodicity that Muslims ought to understand, because they already understand progressive revelation to a degree. They already understand that there were previous revelations to Moses and to Jesus prior to that of Muhammad. So he says, this is the meaning of the day of resurrection spoken of in all the scriptures and announced unto all people. He talks about the importance of this day and the significance that no day is mightier than this day, and that no resurrection more awful in the sense of provoking awe than this revelation can ever be conceived. And he says that the sole and fundamental purpose of all learning and the toil and labor thereof is attainment unto and the recognition of the station, and laments that the people are completely immersed in the pursuit of their material studies and denying this reality. So, and he says one feature of this day of resurrection, which appears with this kind of cyclicality, is that the abased amongst you he shall exalt, and they that are exalted he shall abase. And that is an allusion, of course, not just to, say, Moses and Jesus, which he talks about in part 1 as appearing with all of this prophetic potency, but in the person of individuals who for various reasons have been abased, as Moses was, as Jesus was, but also as the Bab was. So Baha'u'llah is also inviting the uncle of the Bab to look at the Bab himself through a similar sort of lens, not to look at the Bab as someone who had this, a mere merchant, untutored in the ways of the Quran and of divine things, who has this short ministry and is unceremoniously executed under orders of the Shah, but to see rather that abasement as a form of spiritual exaltation. He says, all these things which have in this day hindered this people from attaining the shores of the ocean of eternal grace, the same things in the Muhammadan dispensation prevented the people of that age from recognizing that divine luminary and from testifying to his truth. And then he adds, there's sort of an additional twist to this idea of the return, and that it's not just the return of the prophet. The cyclicality of things and this sort of the circle of existence that we were looking at a few slides before is not something that only happens once. It's something that's kind of always in process. And it's not just the prophets that return from age to age, but it's also, in a sense, their followers and the deniers. All of them are, in a spiritual sense, resurrected, or one doesn't use this word so much in a Baha'i context, but reincarnated, not in the exact sense of Hindu reincarnation, but in the sense of the spirit of faith and the spirit of denial comes back in these individuals to such a degree that Muhammad refers to the people of his day as the people of the past. He says, and this is the point of paragraph 157. It says, they make some point to Muhammad that he refutes by saying, look, already have apostles before me come to you with sure testimonies, and with that of which ye speak. Wherefore slew ye them? Tell me if ye are men of truth. And they said, look, we didn't kill those prophets, and Muhammad says, you did, because you are the return of those people who slew the prophets of the past, just as I am the return of the prophets of the past. So there's a kind of repeat and a reenactment of this divine drama that returns from age to age. So the people didn't fathom Muhammad's statement and attributed ignorance to him, saying he doesn't know what he's talking about, calling us, saying that we slew the prophets of the past. But he affirms that this is the case in paragraph 160. He says, if thou sayest that Muhammad was the return of the prophets of old, as is witnessed by this verse, his companions must likewise be the return of the bygone companions. So this whole idea of return and resurrection, rebirth, and so forth is given this symbolic and recurring meaning that allows Baha'u'llah to make an argument for the Bab being a new chapter in this unfolding chapter-wise story of divine revelation. So now we get into a truly central kind of theological ground zero of the Kitab-i-Iqan, which is where Baha'u'llah has to solve a new problem that's created. And the new problem he's created is, well, if each prophet is the return of the past prophets, if there's a kind of spiritual reincarnation going on here, if this resurrection event means that that Muhammad is essentially the same as Jesus, is essentially the same as Moses, and so forth, then how are they different? How do you get from their oneness and the fact that well, if they return, then you expect them to look the same and have the same name and give the same teachings and so forth, but they don't. They come with a different name, with different teachings, with different scriptures. And so how do you sort of square that circle? How do you have your theological cake and eat it too? How do you get to claim both the essential oneness of the prophets on the one hand and the distinction of the prophets on the other hand? And this is a central pillar of Baha'i theology, and it's introduced here in paragraph 161, which is that the prophets have these two stations. He says, "It is evident to thee that the bearers of the trust of God are made manifest unto the peoples of the earth as the exponents of a new cause and the bearers of a new message. Inasmuch as these birds of the celestial throne are all sent down from the heaven of the will of God, and as they all arise to proclaim his irresistible faith, they are therefore regarded as one soul and the same person, for they all drink from the one cup of the love of God and all partake of the fruit of the same tree of oneness." So that's a oneness piece. These manifestations of God each have a twofold station. One is the station of pure abstraction and essential unity. "In this respect, if thou callest them all by one name and dost ascribe to them the same attribute, thou hast not erred from the truth." Now, this becomes a major topic over the next few paragraphs, and it's actually quite a while, and it's not going to be until next week even that we get to the station of distinction. So we're in the station of abstract unity, and that's where we're going to stay for the rest of tonight. And then he gives quotations in support of this from the Quran. "No distinction do we make between any of his messengers." Also in the Quran, "I am all the prophets. Likewise he saith, I am the first Adam, Noah, Moses, and Jesus." If a Quranic passage is not referred to in the footnote, then it comes from a hadith. And some of the hadiths you can find in Mr. Dunbar's commentary. Otherwise, you have to dig deeper if you want to find out what hadith it comes from, and go to these green references, which are to the Eshraq Khavari's Promise-i-Iqan. And from the page references, you know that this is quite a mighty work of a couple thousand pages at least. So fortunately, Eshraq Khavari has done the homework and figured out what all of these are, what these are all quoting. Our cause is but one. Muhammad is our first, Muhammad our last, Muhammad our all, and so forth. So this is the evidence for this station of pure abstraction and essential unity. And this explains the meaning of the return of the prophets and their chosen ones. He says, "It is clear and evident to thee that all the prophets are the temples of the cause of God, who have appeared clothed in diverse attire. If thou wilt observe with discriminating eyes, thou wilt behold them all abiding in the same tabernacle, soaring in the same heaven, seated upon the same throne, uttering the same speech, and proclaiming the same faith." And that beautiful passage is quoted both in Gleanings and in The World Order of Baha'u'llah by Shoghi Effendi. "Such is the unity of those essences of being, those luminaries of infinite and immeasurable splendor. Wherefore should one of these manifestations of holiness proclaim, saying, I am the return of all the prophets, he verily speaketh the truth." So it's not just that that Muhammad was the return of Christ, or Baha'u'llah is the return of Muhammad, but each one is the return of all of the others. The concept of return is not confined to the sequence of just two prophets in time. But from the standpoint of essential unity, it's they're all the return of all of them. And the return of their chosen ones is also definitely proven by these various passages that Baha'u'llah is bringing out. And he says more about this return of the chosen ones at some length in paragraph 163, and he talks about those chosen ones who return from age to age and how they've been so transformed. That so overpowering was their yearning for God, so uplifting their transports of ecstatic delight, that the world and all that is therein faded before their eyes into nothingness. Have not this people exemplified the mysteries of rebirth and return? And this will become one of the proofs of the Bab's missions towards the end of part 2 of the Kitab-i-Iqan, where he talks about the great suffering and trials of the Bab and his followers. He says, now introducing a really curious topic, he says it is evident that nothing short of this mystic transformation could cause such spirit and behavior, so utterly unlike their previous habits and manners, to be made manifest in the world of being. For some words got scrambled. Their war was turned into peace, their doubt into certitude, their timidity into courage. Such is the potency of the divine elixir, which swift as the twinkling of an eye transmuteth the souls of men. And then Baha'u'llah goes on a little bit of a digression on the potency of the divine elixir. What is Baha'u'llah talking about here? He says, and we're not sure exactly in the context of the Kitab-i-Iqan whether Baha'u'llah is talking about something which possesses only a metaphorical reality or whether it has a literal reality as well. One might indeed imagine, in the context of everything else in the Kitab-i-Iqan, where everything that seems to have a literal meaning really has underneath it a symbolic meaning, which is the true meaning, one might imagine that this question of alchemy and the elixir also is something which really is to be understood symbolically. But the way Baha'u'llah describes it here is something which seems like it could exist in the physical world. He says, regarding the substance of copper, were it to be protected in its own mine from becoming solidified, not sure what that means, it would within the space of 70 years attain to the state of gold. 70 years is a little bit of a tip-off that's the sort of traditional lifespan of the human being. So maybe we're talking about a spiritual process that that takes place over the span of a human life. He says, there are some, however, who maintain that copper itself is gold, which by becoming solidified is in a diseased condition and hath not therefore reached its own state. Be that as it may, the real elixir will in one instant cause the substance of copper to attain the state of gold, and will traverse the 70-year stages in a single moment. Could this gold be called copper? Could it be claimed that it hath not attained the state of gold, whilst the touchstone is at hand to assay it and distinguish it from copper? Likewise, these souls, through the potency of the divine elixir, traverse in the twinkling of an eye the world of dust and advance into the realm of holiness, and with one step cover the earth of limitations and reach the domain of the placeless. I think it's worth, just out of interest, to digress a little bit on this subject of alchemy and the elixir, because Baha'u'llah talks about this at length in many of his tablets. And he talks about it in terms that make clear that this is not simply a spiritual reality, but exists also in the physical world. Why would that be? And what implications does this have for our understanding of the Kitab-i-Iqan as a whole, as so much of the point of the Kitab-i-Iqan is to ask us to go beneath the surface of things, to go beneath the literal interpretations to the symbolic interpretation. It comes to this question of something like the divine elixir, and it seems to exist on both a physical and a spiritual plane. So there may be a deeper principle at work that certain, and maybe it's the same principle at work in part 1 of the Kitab-i-Iqan, where he talks about the stars falling from the sky, and he says this has a symbolic meaning, but at the same time, historically, things do appear in the physical sky at the appearance of prophets. And of course, there's the famous star that appeared that guided the 3 wise men to Jesus at his birth. So maybe this is an example of some deeper principle in which the physical and the spiritual worlds represent a kind of, or are characterized on some level by repetition of certain archetypes. And one archetype is that of transformation, of a sort of a substance sort of from the outside, so to speak, that transmutes something from a state of potentiality to a higher state of actuality. This exists clearly in the physical domain in terms of the transmutation of the soul by the divine elixir of the word, the capital W word. But Baha'u'llah extends this into the physical world. He says at the end of his Kitab-i-Aqdas, his book of laws, in fact, that we have appointed 2 signs for the coming of age of the human race. The first, which is the most firm foundation, we have set down in other of our tablets, while the second hath been revealed in this wondrous book. What are these 2 things? A footnote to the Kitab-i-Aqdas says that the first sign of the coming of age of humanity, and this footnote was written by a committee approved by the House of Justice. The first sign of the coming of age of humanity referred to in the writings of Baha'u'llah is the emergence of a science which is described as that divine philosophy, which will include the discovery of a radical approach to the transmutation of elements. This is an indication of the splendors of the future stupendous expansion of knowledge. What could this refer to? In a tablet, Abdu'l-Baha says, even more explicitly, as for the signs of the coming of age of the human race, mentioned in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, one sign is the advent of universal peace. That's in the Aqdas itself. The other is the unfoldment and appearance of the sister of prophecy, the divine philosophy of which the hidden craft forms a part. And this hidden craft is the craft of the transmutation of elements. The Bab talks about it in many of his tablets, none of which have been translated in authorized translation, but a couple of snippets here from original texts which are available online suggests something about the nature of this reality, which is, to me, absolutely curious and enticing. It suggests something about the way the world works that we haven't yet grasped. He says in one place, know that God hath not created anything without placing within it a letter of the elixir in accordance with its station. Almost as though there's this kind of potentiality for transformation found within all things. Human souls obviously included, but other things as well. He says the knowledge of the elixir corresponds with the knowledge of the creation of the universe. So the 2 are, there's a cosmological implication to this. The Baha'i writings talk about the creation of the universe taking place through the interaction between the active force and its recipient. We mentioned this last week. The letters B and E being joined and knit together, which have kind of potentially cosmic significance, substance and form, matter and energy, the union of apparent opposites. Baha'u'llah, in one of his tablets on this topic, and this is published in the original, and someone with ChatGPT-4 could produce this something approaching this in a few minutes. But this is a provisional translation where Baha'u'llah himself says something about the nature of it and the implications of it. In these days, he says, the wise ones of the earth have repudiated this heavenly secret, this divine wisdom, and amongst themselves have proved beyond doubt that such a thing is impossible. Were we to mention the proofs and arguments of these people, our discourse would become protracted. Be that as it may, the reason for their rejection is the protecting hand of him who is the unconstrained, which hath kept this treasure safe from treacherous eyes and thieving hands. However, it will not be long before some acknowledge its existence and testify to its truth. The appearance of this hidden treasure amongst them is the sign of the coming of age of the world. After its attainment, a great peril and a desolating affliction are in store for the world and its peoples, unless they all enter within the divine paradise. So what does this sound like? It sounds like, and Taherzadeh has connected the dots here, that potentially we're just talking about modern physics, and we're talking about our understanding of the nucleus and nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, which really are a transmutation of elements. Taherzadeh says, the question of alchemy has occupied the minds of people for centuries. During Baha'u'llah's ministry, it was a live issue, and several believers were involved in it. Baha'u'llah urged them not to seek to achieve it at that time. However, he confirmed that transmuting baser metal into gold, the dream of the alchemist, was possible. He promised that it would be realized and asserted that its realization would constitute one of the signs of the coming of age of humanity. He also prophesied that after its discovery, a great calamity would await the world unless mankind came under the shelter of the cause of God. Present-day physicists, through special nuclear processes, are able to transmute various elements into others. Maybe Taherzadeh is right, and that's what this implies. But anyway, it's a topic that absolutely fascinates me because there aren't that many places in Baha'u'llah's writings where we actually have prophetic statements, like clear, still needs interpretation, but clear statements about some future state of the world beyond the fact that we're going to be united one way or another. But the means through which that unity will come about, and something about the calamities through which humanity has to pass. It's interesting that we have some clear statements by Baha'u'llah about this. It's interesting. I don't know how far we can keep going a little bit further down this rabbit hole, if there's interest. Baha'u'llah in his Tablet of Wisdom connects this knowledge to an ancient figure, Hermes, known as Idris in Arabic, and another figure named Balinus, who came after Hermes, who discovered something called an emerald tablet, which is one of the core texts of this this mystical science of alchemy. Baha'u'llah mentions it in one of his tablets, and he quotes Balinus, quoting some of this emerald tablet in one of his tablets, refers to it here in the Tablet of Wisdom. I won't read this, read that, but I'll just leave the slides if you want to look at it later. Another very interesting byway of this is that Isaac Newton was absolutely fascinated in this subject. And after he discovered, after all his work with optics and his work with the laws of gravity, he ended up spending most of the rest of his life on interpretation of biblical prophecies and on alchemy. And one of the things he did was translate from the Latin into English this core text that Baha'u'llah actually cites a part of in one of his tablets. And the entirety of that core text, which is called the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, is here in the translation of Isaac Newton. The basic idea being that there's something that has to be separated, purified, and rejoined, or married, and that overall process is archetypal of the spiritual process of separating out the base elements within our psyches, purifying them to achieve a state of higher union and bliss. This tablet of Balinus and the tablet of Emerald Tablet of Hermes, I found a copy of it in the British Library at one point. In the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris at one point. And there's a lot more interesting stuff about this by some medieval authors, which I'll just leave as like extra credit reading for people who are interested in getting into this after class. We have so little translated by way of the writings of Sheikh Ahmad and Sayyid Kazem Rashdi, who are precursors to the Baha'i Faith, and in some ways anticipated the revelation of the Bab. And so it's interesting and of note that in in some of Sheikh Ahmad's voluminous writings, there is mention of these same figures that Baha'u'llah mentions in his Tablet of Wisdom, mentions of Pythagoras and Socrates and Idris and Hermes, and the origins of wisdom and so forth. So there's really a sense of a continuous kind of semi-hidden intellectual tradition or mystical tradition of this, which is passed through maybe from ancient Egypt and Alexandria, where the mythical origins of Hermes are, through some of the mystical philosophers of Persia, all the way up to Sheikh Ahmad and Sayyid Kazim. This is a tablet where Baha'u'llah quotes part of this emerald tablet. But where Baha'u'llah ends on this whole topic of the elixir is where we would expect, which is that the real focus of his revelation and the focus that he asks us to be primarily engaged in this day is not occupying ourselves with such physical matters, but occupying ourselves with the spiritual process of transformation. He says in one of his tablets, "We desire not that anyone amongst the loved ones should become occupied with this science. Nay, rather, it is incumbent upon thee and upon those who are steadfast in the cause to engage themselves in this day in the remembrance of God and in teaching the cause of him who is the all-compelling, the all-wise. Truly, his love is the most great elixir and the most splendid crown by which the base metal of human hearts is transformed into purest gold." And also in another tablet, very much in the same vein, he says, "O Ali Akbar, the most great elixir is the word of God, and the hand of power hath bidden it issue forth from its concealed mine in this treasured and manifest name." Notice in the Iqan, he talks about it being hidden in its mine. "Nourish it within the alembic of thy heart with the fire of love, after the appearance of its effect within every limb, were an atom thereof to be bestowed upon the dwellers of the world of being, thou wouldst witness all the copper of existence become the purest gold. This is the most great elixir which the pen of the Ancient of Days hath been and still is engaged in mentioning." Incredible mystical potency of the word, and that reminds me of a passage in the Seven Valleys where Baha'u'llah talks about the seeker becoming aflame with the love of God and it shining forth within every limb and member. So returning then to the last couple paragraphs of this part of the Kitab-i-Iqan, Baha'u'llah sums up how the inner mysteries of rebirth and return and resurrection have each, through these all-sufficing, unanswerable and conclusive utterances, been unveiled and unraveled before thine eyes. And he asks the uncle of the Bab to purge his sight from all earthly limitations, that thou mayst behold them all as the bearers of one name, the exponents of one cause, the manifestations of one self, and the revealers of one truth, that thou mayest apprehend the mystic return of the words of God as unfolded by these utterances. So we're still, as I mentioned, in this theme of the mystic oneness of the prophets and of their chosen ones, and of the return of that mystical transformative power that changes them from age to age. He says, "Observe, bringing it again to the presence, the return of the self-same determination, the self-same constancy and renunciation manifested by the companions of the point of the Bayan," which it's the whole point of Shoghi Effendi translating the Dawnbreakers could be said to be unfolding that point that Baha'u'llah makes here, to give us that beautiful vision of the constancy and renunciation of those very first followers, the very first who recognized the revelation of the Bab. So what we'll be looking at starting next week then is, having looked at the concept of return in relation to the chosen ones, we'll look at the concept of return in relation to the prophets, and then move to that second station of the prophets, which is that station of distinction. So summing up the major themes for this week, we were looking at the theme of the continuity of divine revelation, prophetic finality or the lack thereof, its implicit connection to the idea of the seal of the prophets, which will become explicit next week, the 3 degrees of divine revelation, which were adduced in connection with this theme of return to try to locate where does that return take place. And Baha'u'llah argues that return and resurrection takes place in that sort of locus of this historical person who is the same yet different, who returns from age to age to inaugurate the different religious traditions. And we also had a chance to look briefly at the emanative circle and touch upon this idea of repetition of pattern, among which is this idea of elixir as a kind of repeating pattern, which the theme of transformation, which is found not just as a spiritual reality, but as a physical, as Baha'u'llah claims, as a physical reality, one which, as Taherzadeh suggests, may actually have already been discovered, and of which we're witnessing the momentous effects of in this century. So that's all I have for this week.